Greetings, Aqua hello. Happy Sunday or whichever day it is when you're looking at this. We hope that you are well. We hope you are doing as well as you can possibly be on all the necessary fronts, physical, mental, and spiritual. And we hope that you remain at that high level of human functionality. We welcome you to this week's episode of Our Ancestors' Voices, a weekly program sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the AAPRP. And our very important topic for today, why African, quote unquote, Black people don't travel. Why we don't travel. So we're really going to give you some analysis to understand this, what this is all about. Because just like everything, in today's world, everything is quote unquote analyzed through such a superficial lens. So we're going to go deeper and talk about things in with some context about why people don't travel. It's not just because people don't have money. I know that's what people think. Well, I don't travel because I don't have money. And we're going to talk about that. So we're glad that you're joining us today. We give honor and respect to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. And just on that note, we're going to be doing a program next week talking about the integrity and the dignity of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, specifically focusing on groups of indigenous people in this country and their struggle for land reclamation. And if you don't know, when we say reclamation, we mean getting your land back. The dignity and integrity that the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere have illustrated for centuries in that struggle is something to be studied and respected. So we're going to be talking about that next week. We as African people, we definitely need to study that model because a lot of us just don't get it at all. So join us next week for that, but we honor and respect the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. And we, of course, respect our African ancestors who certainly did not fight to the death against the slave masters, certainly did not fight against the death to the colonizers, certainly did not jump over the sides of ships in the Atlantic Ocean so that we could today negotiate with the descendants of the terrorists who kidnapped us for some money. Definitely didn't do that so that we could be satisfied with just voting for crackers and graham crackers and thinking that that's going to solve our problem. They definitely didn't do that. And so we, just like we just mentioned about the indigenous people, we are doing our absolute best today to uphold the integrity and the dignity of our ancestors and their desire for freedom and self-determination, not just some simple way to exist under the oppressor's system, to find some comfort under the oppressive capitalist system. As long as you're comfortable, then you can forget about the millions of us who aren't. Our ancestors didn't die for that. And so we're doing our best to uphold the integrity of their struggle with the integrity of how we struggle today. So we'll start, as we always do, just by simply introducing who we are. Again, Our Ancestors' Voices. This program is sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the AAPRP. And the AAPRP is a revolutionary, independent, revolution meaning that we are for uncompromising change of the existing world political, economic, and social order. Independent in that we answer to no one except the masses of African people. We don't answer to any corporations. We don't answer to any political entities. We answer only to the masses of African people. Mass meaning that we're building a mass party. We're not a vanguard political party. In the tradition of Marxist-Leninist parties, that's not who we are. We're a mass party, which simply means that we believe that every African all over the earth can join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And Pan-African political party simply means that everybody of African descent is an African and belongs to the African nation and should be a part of our struggle to achieve our freedom and forward human progress. And we are based in Africa, which just means what it says, that that's where our organization is situated from. We are not based in the US or Britain or Canada or any of those places, although we have organizers and organizing activity happening in all those places, our base is the national home for African people, which is Africa. It's the only place that we have any justifiable right to call ours. All of us who are in these other places, these lands belong to other people. And we are just there because of the political and economic conditions that forced us to be where we are. And so we don't get to just claim that no more than if a flood forced some people into your house, they don't get to start claiming your house as their property. So that is who we are. And our objective, Pan-Africanism, is defined as one united socialist Africa. In other words, one continental African government to govern the mass quantities of natural and human resources in Africa that fuel and provide the wealth for all the multinational corporations on the planet Earth today. And our strategy to achieve Pan-Africanism is outlined in Kwame Nkrumah's book, which is the cover is on the screen. Hopefully you have a screen you can see. And if you don't, you should, because you miss a lot if you don't. But the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare by Kwame Nkrumah in 1968 lays out our strategy, and we are working that strategy effectively to achieve Pan-Africanism. And this program is one of many programs that the AAPRP sponsors online and in person. And our Ancestors' Voices, this program is hosted each week by myself, Ajamu, and Shakura. Umi is both of our last names because she is my biological as well as ideological daughter. We are both active within the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So to get us started on the topic this week, why African people don't travel, I turn it over to Shakur.
Thank you so much, Comrade. Appreciate it. Greetings, everyone. So, this topic is so special to both of us. And I think for me, as a child whose parents understood the importance of traveling outside of the US, I really benefited greatly from their understanding of why that was necessary and why it was important for me to have those experiences, for me to travel the plane and understand what it meant to, have a 16-hour flight layover in some part of Europe and really being able to pull those things together. I was privileged to go home to the continent when I was 4. We went to Ghana, among many different cities. And then again, when I was 16, we flew to Senegal and went to several different cities, including Dakar, which I had so much fun in. And I think that when we think about why this concept, this topic, if you will, is so important, the reason we wanted to bring it to you all is because we want you to kind of see, pun intended, but also ideologically to see kind of where we're coming from in terms of really painting this picture that you need to paint for yourself. The problem is if you don't have the proper paint, if you don't have the proper paintbrush, metaphorically speaking, then all you can do is just build an idea based off of what someone else is telling you. If we lived in a world where people were rooted in truth and justice, where they were rooted in honesty, where they were rooted in telling nothing but the truth and really describing how Africa has shaped the entire world in terms of all the resources that come from there, all the spices, all the herbs, every single thing that you can get your hands on that would make your cooking more enhanced. It would make your culture more enhanced. It would make you feel good to be walking on that soil. If people were really honest about how magical and valuable Africa really is, then you would be able to trust in that. And maybe you'd be able to take your time trying to get back home to go to the continent. But we don't live in that world where we can trust everything everyone says. We live in a world where propaganda is typically rooted in mistruths and dishonesty to where we can't really trust everything that's being said, especially if it goes against the imperialist ideology, the capitalist ideology, if it goes against the oppressor exploiting and benefiting from the exploitation of the continent, then we can't necessarily trust that what they're saying is going to be true, which is why we're encouraging you all to get out and travel the world. If you are African, we strongly encourage you to take this next trip going back home to the continent as one of the biggest decisions that you will make in your life, and how change worthy and impactful it will be for you. When we talk about this old saying, being rooted in how something brings you something more to life than just talking about it, I really started to understand what that meant when I was 16 years old and we were in Dakar, Senegal. I can't really remember as much when I was 4, but I do remember that there were some momentous occasions that took place. For example, that was our trip was during the time that Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And thankfully, my parents were able to record this experience. So as an adult, I can now watch myself at the age of 4 and do the best I can to try to remember what I thought was taking place because of the suggestion of the visual that I have available to me. But as a 16-year-old, I had so many more imprinted memories that I don't need a camera or a videotape to remind me of. And I think part of that is because it's important for us to have this foundation of political education. And I guess I should stop and rewind for a minute and just say, I think the biggest reason, and I'm sure Comrade Ajamu will agree, the biggest reason that my parents even had the impact and the influence to know that they should take me back home to the continent was because of their organizing with this organization that's bringing you this seminar right now. And so, had we not decided, had they not decided that they didn't want to organize with this group of folks, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here today talking to you about how I'm more confident in being an African because I'm privileged to say that I've been home twice, right? It might be a different story for different people, but I am grateful for those opportunities. And as an adult, that is my next trip that I want to take myself, and I want to fund it myself because I want to be able to experience it as an adult. It's been way too long since I have been back home. 16 would have been the last time. And so much has changed that I need to still be able to pull in all the different pieces that we're trying to bring to you today. So I mentioned political education, for example, because we've always encouraged you all to increase your political education. We've encouraged you to join an organization that's working for justice. And so, even if it's not with our organization, you're still in an opportune space where you can start to develop more of a noteworthy, reliable image, ideology, value, notion, whatever words you want to use to kind of resist the propaganda that's being pushed down your throat, to resist the lies that are insistent on you accepting, and to resist the fact that capitalist media, imperialist media, Zionist media is only going to craft the message that they want you to have. We cannot trust them to craft the message that is based on truth. We can only trust them to craft the message that is based on their agenda being sold, even if it means exploiting people, even if it means killing people, even if it means violating people sexually, whatever the case may be. As long as their agenda is sold and accepted, that's all that matters, so that they can keep promoting and perpetuating their ability to profit and make income. So those are the things that we have to think about. And part of why we're saying so much about the political education piece is, if you know you can't rely on other people to tell you about who you are, if you're African, or even if you're not going back to where you call home, whatever that looks like for you, if you can't rely on people to do that, then you should take it upon yourself to want to do that so that you can start to piece together the pieces that need to have a connecting point to them. For example, it's maybe really hard for you to picture that so many resources come from Africa, but if Africans had control of those resources, the dynamics of how people would treat Africans would have to change. There would be no choice. People would have to respect us because they cannot live in this world without our resources. They cannot live in this world. They can't function. They can't produce the lights, the water. They can't produce the gold. They can't produce the coltan. I was thinking about this as Comrade Ajamu was talking, and it occurred to me that, again, because of my privilege, because of my parents instilling so much information in me, for them deciding to join this organization that's working for justice, and also for me as an adult finally deciding that it was time for me to join, right? Because I've been able to build on what was already instilled in me, and it's starting to make more sense as an adult because now I can put my own experiences when I experience capitalism and start to couple that with other experiences that I've learned about in the past. And it makes sense that I understand how vicious the system is. But I was thinking about when we went back home as a 4 year old and as a 16-year-old, and how it's important to have that political education, because if you don't, especially as an adult who's in work study, then you won't really understand the seminar that we gave a couple of weeks ago about Nigeria and what's really happening to the people of Nigeria, and how basically they are earning 44 US dollars a day, which is not nearly enough to survive off of. And the government is saying, we only have so much money, but they do have money, because if you understand political education, then you understand Nigeria is one of the biggest producers of oil. And everybody in the world needs oil, everyone, which is why Africa is so prominent in producing those resources. You see, the same would be the case with the Congo and producing the coltan that we need to power so many of these devices that have signals and that have Wi-Fi networks and broadband and 5G and all these things. We could think about the gold that comes from Ghana. We need to know that the gold is coming from Ghana, because that's going to help us understand why it's such an exploitive resource and why so many people are literally calling Ghana the Gold Coast, but also because these are resources that we need to start to protect and that we can start to profit off of, again, if Africans controlled the means of those resources. You also need to know that cacao is one of the biggest resources that comes from Ghana, which would explain why Nestle is literally taking over and trying to settle in, because they need that cacao so that they can keep producing their products. But again, if you don't see the connections, right? If you're not thinking about the propaganda, if you're not thinking about the exploitation, then you're not going to be able to bring all of that together. You're not going to be able to understand how ridiculous it is that Nestle is now there in Ghana, and you're not going to be able to understand not only are they attacking the cacao industry, but they're also working as hard as they can to produce formula on the continent, where that was one of the last places that children had to worry about not getting human milk. And now, even on the continent of Africa, we have more babies that are being fed formula than human milk. I'm not sitting here saying that formula is horrible. I'm just saying if human milk is available, and as long as it's not harming the parent or the child, we should never interrupt that. But because we live in a system that values money over people, then we see that formula is a big profitable industry. So it makes sense that they would go over there and tap into that resource. That makes sense from a capitalist standpoint. And we have to understand the capitalist standpoint if we are to attack it and if we are to terminate it. That's where that comes from. The same would be true if we think about the iron and copper that's coming from Senegal. The same would be true if we think about the rubber that's coming from Tanzania. The same would be true if we think about any other resources that are coming from the continent, and how Africa has always been a means to an end for so many exploiters, for so many people who had nothing more than to steal those resources and profit. And then they were able to still find a way to manage that under the neo-colonialism regime. And so we just have so much to think about in terms of how this is impacting people everywhere, especially on the continent. We could also take it a step further and say, even if you were to travel to Africa at some point, and then you decided that you wanted to travel to some other area where maybe the population has a high, it's known to have a high indigenous population. Maybe Spanish is the number one language spoke there. So maybe you go to Cuba or maybe you go to Costa Rica. It's so relevant, I think, to still see that connection of how the transatlantic slave trade had a lot to do with where Africans ended up in the diaspora. And as a young college student, I was privileged to go to Costa Rica for a study abroad, and I had such an epiphany when I stepped off the plane and we were in the airport, and then we were able to take the taxi over to the hotel. It was so interesting to me because there were a lot of people who had very dark skin and looked like me, but they spoke French, they spoke Spanish, they spoke Portuguese, they spoke so many languages. And I was very confused because I didn't understand why there were so many Africans in Costa Rica. And then I started putting things together. I got my map out. I started looking at the transatlantic journey and the voyage and whatnot. And then it started to make more sense to me. And so again, you all, this is where all of that starts to come into play. And we have to think more about that, because if we don't think about that carefully, next slide, please, then we will allow people to tell us about who we are. We will allow them to tell us about where we came from, what our ancestors did. We will allow them to convince us that we are not Africans. You know, as Kwame Ture said, you can't report to yourself in the double negative, but so many of us would say, I am no African, because we didn't even understand the connection of what that really looked like. Even the way language is used, when we think about Black, when we think about African American, when we think about these terms, Black American, right? How all these language and terms have kind of been accepted under this propagandized way that we even think about ourselves. We can't even think about ourselves just as Africans. It has to be coupled with the American, because to just say that we are isolated only Africans would imply so much in terms of what we're not comfortable doing. But the fact remains, we are African, though. That is, in fact, a true statement. It's a very true statement. And as Kwame Nkrumah said, you are not African because you were born in Africa. You are African because Africa was born in you. So, as true as that statement is, it's only going to make the most sense when you are able to be in a space where you can literally be in that space, pun intended. You're going to start to see other people behaving the way you behave. When you go into the barber shop and you see people clowning and cooning and laughing, just like you do when you go to the barber shop here, or when you're able to go to other areas and you start to see things looking a lot differently. I said something so ignorant to Comrade Ajamu just a couple of months ago, and I take ownership of that because it's all a learning experience. But the last time he went home to the continent, he went to Ghana. And I asked him, I said, well, like I'm trying to learn more about the economics of Ghana, how they function, what are their main priorities in terms of their gross domestic product, whatever that looks like. And so I said, well, do they have, like, I know they have hair shops, but do they have nail salons? And he said, yeah. And I said, oh, well, are there Vietnamese people that are doing nails there? Because my frame of mind is so restricted in terms of what I'm exposed to here in the US. Whereas I'm not thinking about in other parts of the world, there may not be a high population of Vietnamese people, but that doesn't mean that the nail service is not being attended to. Clearly, they know it's a form of product of resource profit, and they're going to be able to do it. The only difference is it's Africans who are doing it, because that's the primary majority of people that live there. So I guess what I'm saying as I prepare to close is, when you're able to truly tap into the other 94% of your brain, you're able to start pulling ideas together that you hadn't even thought of, and they become epiphanies over time, because now you're starting to learn about things that you hadn't really thought of. When I was 4, I didn't worry about getting my nails done. When I was 16, I didn't worry about it. But as an adult, that is something that I'd be interested in doing. So I'm starting to think about how my life might be shifted and shaped based on me going back home to Ghana, and what that experience could be like for me, especially because I see so many comrades in our work study circle, in at home on the continent, and they do have manicures. So it's making me start to think more and more about connecting these pieces and being able to see all of this from that scope. And so we just encourage you all to seriously consider what that looks like. There are too many groups that are organizing itineraries where they have a set up plan situation where you can start to send money monthly to help pay for the cost, and have one of the best experiences that you couldn't have even imagined you would have. Not only will you have fun and you'll be able to bask on the beach on the West African soil, but you'll also be able to go to some museums like the W.B. Du Bois Museum, but also like the Kwame Nkrumah Museum. And then some of these names that you hear us talk about every week are not going to be so distant, because now you're going to actually be seeing on the soil where Kwame Nkrumah was the president just how impactful his work was. You're going to be able to see the connections of how he too had this connection with the Milcar Cabral. You're going to see some connections for Sekou Touré. And most importantly, we suggest that you go to some of the slave castles or the slave dungeons if you can, because that is the essence of how you truly know not only that you come from fighters, and not only that you come from people who love you and would do anything for you, which is why they sacrifice for you, but you'll also really have a clear understanding that they didn't just walk consentively onto the slave ships. So, contrary to what ignorant people will tell you, we fought to the point where our nails were dug into the rocks, and you can still feel the nail scratches to this day. You can't tell me that that is a submissive people who did something like that. And you also can't tell me that that is a group of people who didn't know who they were, where they came from, and most importantly, where they wanted to go. Ashe.
Obrigada, Asante Sana, Medasi, thank you. Just one necessary correction. So the Naira is the currency in Nigeria, and the Nigerian government, trying to respond to the uprisings happening there, raised the minimum wage throughout the country from 70,000 Naira, which equals the equivalent of 44 US dollars. But that's a month, not per day. So I can understand why you would think it was per day, because it's like, how the hell can people survive on $40 a day income? And the concept of people having to do that um, for a month, that'd be their income for a month. It should be inconceivable to anybody that has any kind of intelligence and morality. But this is what we face all throughout Africa. So, on this question, just some questions to ask you, those of you out here watching this and listening. Were you aware that only about 10% of the people throughout the African continent, you're talking about roughly about 1.5 billion people, have active passports, and that the majority of African people in Africa don't travel more than the equivalent of 50 miles their entire life? In other words, they're basically in the same physical space their entire life. They don't do any travel. So this is important for a number of reasons. For this particular topic, it's important because clearly our people are not able to move and be able to experience and do the things that Shakura talked about. But also, it's also indicative of the fact that many of you who are outside of Africa, and you have contacts with Africans born on the continent who are also outside of Africa, those folks, by and large, do not represent the average person on the continent, the majority of people in Africa. You have to have some juice to get a visa to come into, with this anti-immigrant atmosphere, 9/11, all of this reactionary, anti-African, anti-colonized people fervor that's been sweeping the world for the last several decades. You're not going to get a visa to come into the United Snakes of America. You're not going to get a visa to come into Europe or Canada unless you have some juice, you have some real resources and some reason that would justify them allowing you to allow, that would justify them granting you a visa to come into these countries. And that's important to mention because there are a lot of people of these 1.5 billion people we're talking about who will never have enough money to travel internationally. But there are a number of people who do, who will not be permitted to do that for the reasons that I just mentioned. Political reasons, racist reasons. They won't be able to do that. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. And then also, even within the United States, only about 19% of Africans in the US. There's approximately 50 million Africans in the US. And I know the census every 10 years says 30 million, but we're revolutionary organizers. So we know how to do our demographic work. We don't rely on the US Census Bureau. We know that a large percentage of our people live in the southern US, about half. And we know where the urban areas are in the South, and we can just do the math and look at the populations in the southern states. And we do this all the time. And based on that, we can determine how many of our people are approximately in this country. So we know it's much closer to 50 million than 30 million. Plus, when I was a very young man, 18 years old, I worked for the Census Bureau, going door to door collecting the data. I was a college student, and that was the way I could earn money. So I did that then, and I saw all of the Europeans. I was doing it in a low income neighborhood, and I was the only African they had employed, and in San Francisco. And so I saw all of the Europeans who were working there sitting on the curb, because at that time you got paid, and this was true up until the last couple of cycles. You got paid based on how many completed census forms you turned in. So I saw all these people sitting on the curb outside of the office filling out the forms. They didn't knock on the doors. They didn't, our people don't respond to that. That's the joke from the movie Wash, or what is it, with Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. I think it's called Wash, and DJ Pooh is there, and they kidnap George Wallace, and they're trying to call and see who's in the house, and the sister acts like she's from the Census Bureau, as DJ Pooh calls it. And that's what the joke is. We don't respond to government. So, they don't really, my point is, they don't really have any idea how many Africans are in the US, but we do. So we say 50 million. And so of these 50 million Africans, only about 19% of us have active passports. And of that 19%, a large percentage of those folks got their passports through the US military. So that doesn't count, because you didn't initiate the capacity to travel on your own. You have to have the slave master tell you, okay, you're going to travel anymore. So you don't get any credit for that, because if that's the case, you're not traveling to inform your mind about the world. You're traveling to perform a function for the slave master. So you don't get credit for that. And then another percentage of that 19% are people who only travel to tourist destinations, like places like the Virgin Islands. Nothing wrong. The Virgin Islands are beautiful. Nothing wrong with the Virgin Islands. I've been there, but travel destinations like that, the islands off in the Caribbean, people only travel to those places where you're only going to see the areas that are set up to provide you access as a tourist. You're not going to be steered towards the areas that represent the life of an everyday person in those countries. It's just like Zionist Israel. These clowns, a lot of these NBA players, these basketball players, they go over to Zionist Israel. They're invited. I saw one with Draymond Green, and he went over to Zionist Israel, and he was practicing shooting a 50 caliber machine gun with the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. And he was talking about how beautiful it was over there. Well, clown, they're only going to take you and show you what they want you to see. Your black ass did not go through Gaza and walk the streets by yourself. You didn't do that. So you don't know a damn thing about what's happening in occupied Palestine. And that's the reason why this question of travel is so critical and so important, because if that's how you break down a lot of this narrow information that's designed to get us to think a certain way. And the point is that, a lot of our people are just not traveling. As it relates to people on the continent, a lot of that is going to be economic. People just don't have the means to travel. And then some of it is political, as I mentioned. It's limited where you can get a visa to travel to. I mean, there are literally women do ads in newspapers in some parts of Africa, like advertising, like you go over there, they'll marry you just so you can bring them back to backward cesspool countries like this. So that's the unfortunate reality. The physical and psychological limitations of colonialism and neocolonialism are important as well, because you can't just say it, particularly Africans in the US and in other places where Africans have better financial resources, like Canada, or even throughout Europe, or even some places in Africa, right? Like Cape Verde Islands, for example, where, Africans have, by and large, a higher income capacity and still don't travel much. Like if you just look at Africans here in the US, still don't travel. Like you don't know, you can count on one hand the number of Africans you know who have made it their intention and followed through to travel anywhere in Africa. And they are, I'm talking about people who work and have credit cards and have the ability to travel. And many of them may have traveled, but they haven't traveled to Africa. They travel to Europe, they travel to places like that. In fact, the majority of Africans in the US who have traveled outside the US have decided to go to Europe first before they go to Africa. They've gone all over Europe. They've gone to France and Britain and Belgium and Italy and these types of. You can hear Negroes talking like this all the time. They have never gave a serious thought to going to Africa. And so that's a reflection not of economic restrictions, but of psychological colonialism, right? Because we are trained to think like Europeans. We've been colonized for hundreds of years to think like Europeans. This is the reason why an African can come to you and ask you what your name is. My name is Ajamu. Oh, that's an interesting name. Now imagine this: an African named Jones and Smith and Williams comes to me, and when they learn my African name, their first response is, oh, that's an interesting name. And I always respond the same way. No, actually, it's interesting that you are as black as that pavement and you have a British name or a French name or a European name. My wife was talking about my aunt, her by my marriage, her aunt, and they have a French name because they're people from Louisiana, and the French colonized Louisiana. My family had a French name before I gave the Europeans their name back decades ago. But I was raised with a European French name. And my wife's aunt would always tell them as she was growing up, well, we're French. You know, we're French because they have a French name. No, you're not French. You were the property of the French. So this is the colonial mentality that we still have in 2024. And so because of that, we don't have a perspective to see beyond, okay, if we can get up the capacity to travel and we have a French name, we should go to France because that's our heritage. No, those are the people that owned you like a dog. You should go to Africa and find out who you were before the French owned you as property. But we don't have that type of consciousness. So because we don't have that type of consciousness, we never think that we should go to Africa. And so as a result, most of us don't go, even though financially we could go if we wanted it. And as someone who's traveled to Africa numerous times, I do workshops on how to travel to Africa because I've seen this problem for 25 years. And I show people how they can get there very inexpensively. I don't know if that's the word, it's not my language, but without having to spend thousands upon thousands of dollars, there's a way to get to Africa and have a comfortable, fun time doing it. There are ways to do that. Of course, there are also ways to go to Africa and live like royalty. You know, you're not like, well, I don't want to go to Africa because of the bugs or living in, I mean, this is the type of colonial mentality that we have. And I even had once when I was living in Oregon, I wanted to get the people, nobody had traveled anywhere that had joined the work study process. And like most of our people, hadn't read anything, hadn't traveled anywhere, but you couldn't tell them anything. They knew everything about everything. And so my way of attempting to challenge that is I wanted to organize a trip to go to Africa. And we did a GoFundMe. I set it up, the GoFundMe, and was like, we're going to raise money for people to go. And I told them, I'll buy my ticket. I've been to Africa many times. I'm trying to get you all over there. So all you have to do is get your passport and we'll raise money for the ticket. And couldn't get people to fill. I even printed the forms for them, the passport forms. Couldn't get them to do it. And one of them, I was talking to her and I'm like, what is the problem here? And she's like, well, I just haven't had time. But I'm like, but I see you all the time. And a lot of your life is spent engaging in foolishness. So you have plenty of time. So it's not that. What is it? I mean, I told you I paid for it. You don't even have to pay for anything. What is the problem? And so she finally was at least honest after so much back and forth and said, I'm scared. I'm scared to go to Africa. I don't know what's going to happen to me if I go there. And that's total reactionary capitalist anti-African propaganda, but it's strong. It was real for her. You know, it was nothing I could say that could convince her. And that was 10 years ago. And that African still is not, I haven't talked to them in 8, 9 years. And I guarantee you, they still haven't made a single stride to go to Africa. I know that's true because that type of negative propaganda is strong with us. And that has nothing to do with money. This African had no financial expenditures and they could have gone home and they still didn't do it. So this is why we're having this program, because this type of psychological slavery is a major impediment in helping us unite and move forward as a people. And so we have to be able to attack this on a positive level. Our people don't mean to be it, because there's no way as an African you can be scared of going to Africa and not hate yourself. There's no way, because Africa is you. So if you're scared of Africa, you're scared of yourself. So this is the battle. This is the struggle that we have to engage in to try to correct these problems, these psychological colonial mentality problems that our people face. And just like the graph on the screen, that's why, hopefully you have a screen, you should be looking at it. But African people have passports on a collective percentage of about 12% of us worldwide. 2.5 billion people, about 12% of us worldwide have active passports, not one that you got when you were in the military 20 years ago and it's been expired for 20 years ago and you never even had an inkling to do it because you weren't planning on going. We're not talking about you. We're talking about people who have active passports like myself, that are ready to travel whenever we need to go. Only 12% of us are able to do that. But at the same time, on a worldwide basis, we consume 35% of the grape soda produced in the world. So I'm not putting you down if you like grape soda. Enjoy your damn grape soda. The point is our priorities and how we're trained to think like property still, even though slavery has been eradicated for 150 years, even though colonialism has been eradicated for 50, 60, 70 years, we still think like a colonized people. We still think like an enslaved people. And this is what we have to combat as revolutionaries and people who want to see our people move forward. So why does this discrepancy exist? Is it finances? Is that it? Yeah, like we said, it is that, particularly for people outside of the US and outside of the so-called technologically industrialized countries. That's valid for those folks. And there are, as I mentioned, tons of political reasons designed to keep those folks from being able to travel. But for Africans in Europe, in Canada, in the United States of America, and places like that, it's oftentimes not finances, even working class people. Because people will tell me, and I've gone to shops on traveling to Africa, and people say, well, I just can't afford it. And I've even sat down with people and gone through, I've told them, well, can we do a budget? Can we see what you have financially and get a better picture? And I've done that with numerous people and sat down and, by the time we cut down on the trips to the weed dispensary, to the liquor store, by the time, I'm just telling you for real, by the time we cut down on going out to the club, by the time we decided that we didn't need a 55-inch television, a 40-inch or 32-inch would work just as well. By the time we didn't need a $3,000 couch in our house that we're paying credit on or paying rent to own and just throwing money down the drain, we didn't need all these, whatever, I don't know, Versace purses or whatever the hell it is. We didn't need all that. By the time we worked through all of that nonsense, there was all kind of money to go to Africa and back several times. And don't leave here and lie. Nobody's saying that you can't have nice things. Go ahead and you're going to have them anyway, because that's what a lot of us are specifically focused on. But what we're saying is that don't lie and say you don't have the money to travel to Africa when you have plenty of money. It's just your priorities are not on going home to Africa. They're on all those other things I just got through mentioning. So that is a discussion that we have to have. So yeah, finances is an issue, particularly for our people at home and other places like Central, South America, some parts of the Caribbean. This is true. And even some of our people in the so-called industrialized countries, this is true. But, this is a place. There are many of us who know how to raise money for the purposes of liberation. We can get people home. If somebody really wants to go to Africa, we can figure out how to get them home. That is not something that there's no way we can do that because we don't have the money. That's just not true. So there's that. And then yes and no. The Africans in the US who do travel, again, this is the part where it's not necessarily finances. Again, as we said, primarily go to Europe or tourist destinations like cruises and those types of things. And don't ever go and think because they went on a cruise that they've traveled internationally. No, what you're doing when you go on a cruise, it's like you taking a tour of a prison and then saying, well, I was in prison. No, you took a tour of a prison. You didn't live the life of being incarcerated in a prison. When you go on a cruise, you took a tour of these countries. You went to tourist areas. You didn't live the life going in these places and understanding. And most of these tours, these cruises rather, that go to places like Jamaica, they don't even go where they don't go to Kingston, Jamaica. Like they'll take you to I can't even remember the tourist place with the waterfalls in Jamaica. You've been there. I've been there before, going somewhere else, but I don't remember the name of the place because that wasn't that wasn't the focus of where I wanted to go in Jamaica. But that's where they take you. So you're not really getting a sense of what the everyday people are experiencing, right? And cruises are not going to places that really reflect the opportunity for you to understand what's going on in the world. You're not taking a cruise to Cuba. You're not taking a cruise to Haiti. You're not, so you're not really doing the type of travel that we're talking about. And the real drivers behind this issue is it's our lack of identity and all the vestiges of our colonized experiences. Because based upon the income levels that we have, just looking at the United States of America, in all these industrialized countries, it should be at least 35 to 40% of us who have traveled to Africa, at least. And if we had that, if we had 4 out of 5 people, or 3 to 4 out of every 10 people in the US, Africans, have traveled to Africa, we wouldn't have so many of these dumbass discussions that we see happening today. We wouldn't have them. Because people would, and people, I give them credit. They're trying. There are so many people who are traveling to Africa for the first time, and they're coming back and they're making the most wonderful videos. Even the singer Khalees, who, sings "My Milkshake Come to the," whatever it is, that song. I can't think of it right now. But she travels to Africa often and comes back and does some wonderful videos. So people are trying to educate, but we're so anti-information and so anti-intellectualism. We've been dumbed down so much that you can't tell us anything. We know every goddamn thing. My sister is like that. You can't tell her anything about anything. She knows everything. She hasn't been in high school in almost 50 years and hasn't turned one page of a book. I used to tell her, you haven't said anything new in 20 years. And it's true. She used to get mad, but it's true. You don't like it, do something about it. So we got to address this identity question, because this is the thing that's holding us back. This is the thing that's keeping us from reaching our full potential. It's like Shakur said, I remember when I was in Oregon, I used to tell the Africans about Kwame Nkrumah, and it was like a deer in the headlights. And then finally, we went home to Ghana, that trip that I was organizing. We went in 2015, and only one person did the work to go. So that person got their ticket paid for. I paid for my own ticket. I raised the money for their ticket. I paid for my own ticket, and they went. And I would argue that person is a dedicated cadre organizer within the APRP today. And I would argue that that trip had a significant it had a significant contribution. They were already doing work, but most of the people, it takes time to understand the work of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. It took me 3 or 4 years to really understand what this organization was talking about. I was doing work the whole time, but I didn't really understand it. And so people were doing work. This person was doing work. But I think going home, like Shakur said, and participating with the comrades on the ground in Ghana and seeing the work that Kwame Nkrumah did and looking at that work and connecting it through the theory, I would argue made a significant contribution in that comrade intensifying their dedication to building the APRP and the Pan-African work that we do. So that's why this lack of identity is so important, because if we could crack that nut and get our people to a level of consciousness where we understand who we are, then we can get to that 3 or 4 out of 10 people going home. It'll make everything else we're doing so much easier. That's without question. So when we talk about changes, that's why the essential need for mass political education is so important. And, just to understand the work of the APRP, like there are a lot of groups who are doing mutual aid work. That's a wonderful thing. I've done, those of you trying to tell me about mutual aid work, I was doing it before you even knew what it was. So I understand what it is. I respect it. It's great work. For those people doing self-defense training, I do that all the time. I respect it. That's great work. People growing food. Hey, there's a garden in my backyard. I don't do it. My wife is the expert, but we don't even really buy vegetables. We grow them in our backyard. I help to the extent I've learned a lot. I've done a lot of work out there with her, but I understand that. I've done a lot of work growing vegetables, providing food to people. That's important work. But the work that the APRP is doing, and we do all of those things, I just said that, but the primary work that we do is around these questions I'm bringing up, raising our people's consciousness so that we can understand who the hell we are, so that we can point ourselves in the right direction to be able to properly address our problems on a collective level. That is the work that we do. And doing it in English and French and Portuguese and Spanish and Creole and all of these languages, Swahili, this is the work that we do. And the reason why I say it like that is because there are a number of people doing all those other types of work that I just mentioned. I don't see anybody else doing this type of work besides us. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just saying I wish there were tons of people doing this work. It would make our work so much easier. But this, to me, is the important component, because if we don't have this consciousness raising work happening, all of those other things have a very limited end game in terms of what they can accomplish. We can feed some people, we can help some people learn to feed, but we will never grow the capacity to overthrow this system, which is the reason why we have to do those things in the first place and have this scarcity culture. We have plenty of land to grow food. We have plenty of resources to be able to provide people with jobs. The problem is that we don't control them. And the reason why we don't control them is because we don't know who the hell we are. And as long as we don't know what the hell we are, we will not come together and organize so that we can take control of what should rightfully be ours. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about this question of travel. It's not about you just going to Africa so you can be a Western American Negro or Canadian Negro or German Negro or some other kind of coon representing the slave master going to Africa, buying up a bunch of clothes, eating and getting all the food and farting it out, and then just come back and be the same worthless human being that you were before you went. That's not the point of this topic today. The point of this topic today is that we as a people have to figure out how to break down the colonial barriers that have been set up to prevent us from understanding who we are, because as long as we don't know who we are, we will never question why the people who have everything got what they have by robbing what rightfully belongs to us, and why we don't have anything. And because we don't know, many of us will side with them and become graham crackers for them and take on their talking points. Yeah, these people are lazy, that's why they don't have anything. As long as we don't know, this is the kind of foolishness that we'll be subjected to. So our work is to raise that consciousness and begin to frame our own perspective of who we are in this world beyond how our enemies wish us to see the world, and travel and study, and even at the higher level, studying and traveling to do the work, which is what I do. I don't go on tours. I go to do work with our people around the world. That's why you can't tell me we're not one people, because I know my whole life has been working with our people who speak French, speak Spanish, who speak Portuguese. That's been my whole life. So you're a damn fool trying to tell me, well, they don't like us. I mean, you're a damn fool. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. And that's how I talk to, I'm sorry, that's how I talk to people. You know what you're talking about. Here, take these books, read them, and then come back to me. I'm not wasting time with ideology. It's like standing on the corner talking about who defecates the best. I don't have time for that kind of nonsense. You may as well be saying that to me when you come to me talking about they don't like us over there. Shut the hell up. And as Kwame Ture said, when you're sick, you take an aspirin. Why not when you're ignorant, don't you read? Join an organization working for our people. That's what we need to do. And that will take us where we need to go. And then we'll be traveling all over the place. So we thank you for joining us. We invite you back next week, November 3rd. We're going to be talking about the dignity of the indigenous people's struggle. We're going to be talking about the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, the real indigenous people, the people who identify as Native Americans, as indigenous people, as Mexicanos, Puerto Ricanos, those folks. They are the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. First Nations. I'm not talking about anybody else that's confused, anybody that's European calling themselves indigenous. All you Africans who know nothing about Africa, and this whole last hour has been what you should be listening to, because you don't know anything about who you are. We're not talking about you. We're talking about the real indigenous people and the integrity and the dignity in their indigenous resistance struggle. We, as confused African people, have a lot to learn from how the indigenous people have refused to compromise and accept money and are fighting instead for their land back. We have a lot to learn, because many of us will take a check in a minute from the slave master. So join us next week as we talk about that. The upper left QR code, the red one, has valuable information in it. It has other AAPRP programs, including this one, so you can tune in to them. The Forward Ever shop, so you can buy revolutionary African clothing that reflect revolutionary conscious raising messages. We definitely want that. If you don't want to wear them, buy them for someone, pass them out, do something to help. By doing that, you help spread the consciousness, and you also support revolutionary independent African organizations. So if you say that's what you're about, you should be doing it. You can find Hood Communists there. You want to do that. And then also join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Go to aprp-intl.org and watch the orientation video and join. And then you can contribute to the APRP's work. Your money, when it's contributed, goes to our work in Africa, all throughout the African continent. So you can do that by going to Venmo at A-APRP or PayPal at AAPRP no dash. And the lower right-hand corner, you can support one of our many projects on the ground in Africa, Burkina Books in Burkina Faso. So do that, building this revolutionary consciousness we're talking about, and support my book. That's Building Revolutionary Consciousness, a guide for organizing defense against white supremacist, patriarchal, and fascist violence, a guide for organizing defense against white supremacist, patriarchal, and fascist violence, by me, Ajamu Umi. You can get it. Unfortunately, the only place is on Amazon. It's only $8 US. We use the proceeds to finance our anti-fascist work that we do on a consistent basis, so that when you are caught by these fascists, You have people who are prepared to defend instead of just yelling and why me? Why is it happening to me? Because you're not organized and prepared. That's why it's happening to you. It won't happen the same way to me. I guarantee you. Not because I'm but organized and I'm prepared. And the crackers know that because they made efforts for a long time. And many of them that made those efforts have paid for it. And so I want to create other people who can do the same thing. So buy the book and help us create more capacity to do that. Forward ever, backwards never. Enjoy the rest of your day.